Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. Tonight is Comprehensivist Wednesdays, and we will be covering brains and AI. Can emergence explain their evolution? This is part of an ongoing series with neuroscience that Sanjay has been leading, and look forward to exploring tonight's topic. With that, I will turn it over to Sanjay.
Great. Thanks, Joe. So, yeah, in this group for people who are new, I see some names that I don't recognize. So we try to go into, we focus on neuroscience, not just human, but all animal physiology and behavior. But one of the main areas that we look at is human behavior. And we've been doing this for, I think, just over 2 years. And in a lot of the issues that we look at, we also look at complementary or parallel areas, for example, artificial intelligence. And that's an area that's been expanding really very rapidly recently. And that's an area that does help us to understand behavior and brain, specifically because the neural networks that we talk about, the artificial systems, the modern ones are basically artificial neural networks. And every brain, every biological, neurological system is also a neural network system. And we call the biological neural network system natural or just a neural network system, and the artificial ones are artificial. But they are, one is a subset of the other. The artificial one is a simplified subset of natural systems, and they show a lot of the same behaviors and characteristics that we see in real biological systems. So that the fact that there is similarity intentionally, because the artificial ones are created to behave and mimic certain aspects in a simplified way, to mimic certain aspects of real brains. Because of that, there's parallels that we can extrapolate. We can it can help to explain. But also, as these systems get more and more complicated, and the more recent ones, especially, and everybody, I suspect, has heard of ChatGPT. And now there's a newer model called GPT-4, and there actually talks of other models that may actually come out sooner than next year. So these newer systems are exhibiting behaviors that are astounding. In the media, there've been speculation. One very famous case with a Google employee who thought very strongly that one of those systems had attained consciousness. It had not, but this person thought so, and it became spread through the news. So there are a lot of ideas and I might say misinformation or misunderstanding of these systems. But at the same time, these systems do exhibit a lot of behaviors that are human-like, or at least animal-like in many ways. And that's why these systems serve as a good tool for us to look at what might be happening in natural and normal, in biological systems. So let me start. What I typically do is I have a slideshow that helps to guide some of the discussion. So let me start this. 1 second while I do that. Okay, so hopefully everyone is able to see this.
There's some of the
I don't know what to do about that. That happened earlier. I think the Zoom meeting control, it may block a part of the screen. I mean, that's what it seems like is happening. So I moved it. It should be down at the bottom. Whatever, if it's covering something, you'll see it at the bottom now. I'll try to move that around so that it doesn't block too much. So anyway, let's go into this. So basically what we're looking at is emergence. That's the idea that I think should help us to frame our understanding of what is actually happening in biological brains. Emergence is tonight, what I want to do is focus on emergence in these artificial intelligence systems. So first, before we delve too far into this, let's just start with some basic definitions. So, and emergence is a concept that's been studied in many different areas. It doesn't exist only in artificial intelligence. It actually exists in one of the quotes that I found, which was by a philosopher. He studied the topic of emergence for many years, and he came up with a pretty good explanation of it, which I'll have in an upcoming slide. But the more prosaic definitions, or the more common definitions, I think are the initial ones that I'll list here. And I think these are a little more easier to understand, so I start with these. So emergence is when quantitative changes in a system result in qualitative changes in behavior. And quantitative changes are basically changes that you can enumerate. For example, the size of the system, or the if you were thinking of a brain, a biological brain, the number of neurons in that brain, or the mass of that brain, the amount of the mass of the brain tissue, the neurological tissue, that is a quantitative change. So as the mass of the brain, the size, the weight of the brain, weight is not mass, but in a simple sense, as the mass of a brain changes, and specifically as it gets higher, you can end up having qualitative changes or qualitative improvements in behavior. A more complex behavior arises, and vice versa. If the size of the brain decreases, those qualitative changes cause degradation in behavior. So that first sentence applies to biological systems very strongly, because we see with animals and even insects, and across the scale of animalia, we see that as the size of a brain, and conversely, as the number of neurons in a brain, that's specifically more the important characteristic. And actually, there's another characteristic, which is the number of neurons in the, what you might say, the cortex. Not all animals have a cortex, but there are comparable regions, similar to the cortex that many of the non-insect have. So as the size of the cortex, or the number of neurons in the cortex, changes, either increases or decreases, there are qualitative changes in behavior in that animal, either increasing or decreasing in complexity. Another definition is an ability is emergent if it is not present in smaller models, but is present in larger models. And this is kind of saying the same thing that we said earlier. So some of these, I'm trying to say these in different ways so that it makes sense to everyone. Everyone has different ways of understanding. So hopefully this should help. We want to have an intuitive understanding of exactly what is emergence. I'm trying to get at that, because I think that's very important for us to start with. So also another definition, emergence refers to the situation in which an object of study exhibits properties that its individual elements do not possess by themselves. So what we're talking about is an object of study, you might say, is a system. A system may be, let's say, the planet Earth, the entire planet. And the properties of planet Earth exhibits properties that its individual elements do not possess. So for example, the individual elements of planet Earth, it might be a tree, it might be the ocean, it might be volcanic activity somewhere on the planet, it might be atmospheric events. So each of those individual elements of planet Earth by themselves do not explain all of the behaviors we see on planet Earth. So for example, the fact that planet Earth is orbiting around a star really has nothing to do with the volcanic activity on Earth or the oceans or anything else. And the environment, one of the things that is easier to see is the environment on Earth. The atmospheric environment on Earth is affected by a lot of those individual elements. So for example, volcanic activity does impact the environment. So if there are clouds of smoke or plumes of ash that are emitted, they eventually go into the atmosphere and they affect the environment. Similarly, ocean. If you have ocean that is very high in temperature, and the water vapor, water pressure and water vapor evaporates very quickly, it goes into the atmospheric composition changes, and the environment, the atmospheric environment changes. So all of these things would cause an effect on the atmosphere. But even then, it would not cause an effect on the overall planet. The stability of the Earth, the wobbling of the Earth on its axis, these things wouldn't be affected by it. I mean, they would have microscopic effect, but not substantial effect. So anyway, the overall properties of a large complex object under study is not explainable by the individual elements. And similarly in a brain, the individual neurons that comprise a brain, whatever size the brain is, the individual neurons do not explain what happens in the entire brain. Now, when you're talking about a small brain, a brain of only, let's say, 500 neurons, it's much easier to look at it. And in those simple types of brains, you actually can. This emergence does not happen. That's where, and that's where in the neurosciences, we're really still studying very, very small brains, brains on the order of 2,000 neurons or less, because those can be understood and managed, using the tools we have today. Whereas human brains, even mammalian brains, are too complex for us to study in this way. And so, anyway, so that's another aspect. Another part of the definition is that emergence refers to behaviors or abilities that only emerge with scaling. And scaling is a very important idea here, because scaling, again, as we scale, as we enlarge or shrink, the system we're talking about, whether it's a neural system or any other system in the world, this same thing happens. Emergence of new, never before seen behaviors or abilities arise through large-scale scaling. All right. And this is actually a slide I was referring to earlier about the philosopher who studied this idea. And so his take on it, he wrote a paper about this specific topic about emergence in 2006. And his take is emergence is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. Not only can the phenomenon be observed in various systems, the term itself can be found throughout the scientific literature, from physics to sociology and everything in between. And what he means by scientific literature is not specifically what we generally term as science, but he uses this phrase in a much broader sense of published literature of a specific type of quality. So and the examples he cites, he goes into art and creativity and other areas also.
Excuse me, Sanjay. Actually, could you who is the philosopher to whom you're referring to?
So this is his name. Sorry, let me move this. So Jakob de Haan, he's the author of this paper, and there are many other philosophers, but his paper did a pretty good job, and he's referenced by many others. He's cited by many others. He did a pretty good job. It's a very long paper, and he went into many different aspects of it. This is just one synopsis that I have from that. So Jakob, Jakob de Haan, he's from the Netherlands. He's actually a professor. Actually, his main area of study is I believe it's economics, but this paper is in an area of philosophy. So anyway, and what another thing that he wrote to try to distill it, and this is what I think might give us the most broadest definition of emergence. So the common denominator, as he wrote, is that some property or phenomenon is observed. So basically the common denominator of emergence appears to be that some property or phenomenon is observed that somehow transcends the level of the objects that nevertheless produce it. So multiple objects that comprise a more complex system. The observed properties and phenomenon from those individual smaller objects don't explain the larger system that they comprise together. So, transcending is a concept here that we need to understand, that the idea of emergence is that as a system grows, and this applies to many types of systems, not simply biological systems, as a system grows beyond a threshold. So it's important to understand there's a threshold that we're talking about. So, for example, with brains, with neurological systems, when we look at very, very small organisms, which have, by definition, very small brains, on the order of thousands or even millions of neurons, which is, on the scale we're talking about, tiny. A million neurons is a tiny brain. Human brain has 86 to 100 billion neurons. Many mammalian brains have between 20 and 20 to 50 million, including humans, up to 100 billion neurons. Sorry, so 20 billion up to about 100 billion neurons are common for animal brains, mammalian brains especially. So when you're talking about 20 billion neurons, a few million is percentage-wise, it's 0.0001%. It's a pretty small fraction. Most small organisms don't have complex brains, so their brains have not reached the threshold that we're talking about in terms of emergence. These are, again, the fact that there's a threshold, that's important. The fact that there is the systemic nature of the individual elements that comprise a system, their behaviors by themselves don't elicit the complex behavior that you see in the full system. These are all aspects that are important for us to understand. Now, a system, so what this means is that when a system, when sufficiently large, and large again is a vague term, I put it in quotes, but when it's sufficiently large, because there is a threshold that needs to be surpassed, these systems begin to exhibit behaviors that cannot be explained by the sum of their parts. And at that point, after that threshold, they begin to exhibit behaviors that we call emergent behaviors. Another characteristic of emergent behaviors is that we cannot explain them simply by the elements of that system. So, for example, simply understanding the neurons of a system and the interactions between neurons, even if we're talking about millions of neurons acting together, even that, if we understand how millions of neurons work together, that still does not sufficiently explain these emergent behaviors, such as awareness that we see in animals, in more complex animals. Insects, to some extent, don't have the type of awareness that we think of when we talk about humans and dogs and even mice. The types of awareness that mammals have is much more complicated than the awareness that what we see in insects. Insects have an awareness of the physical world around them. They understand that they're on objects, and they have a sense, depending on their the type of sensory systems that they have. Many of them don't have eyes. Some of them use chemical detectors similar to our nose. Their antennae, for example, on ants. So the behaviors in very complex systems, very large systems, cannot be explained simply by looking at the smaller elements and scaling them up. If you have 1 million neurons and you understand how those 1 million neurons interact in a certain way, if you amplify or grow those into, let's say, 1 billion or even 20 billion neurons, replicating them over and over and over, 10,000, 20,000 times to reach multiple billions, you still will not, your understanding from the replication of those 1 million neurons, our understanding doesn't increase to the level to be able to explain these emergent behaviors that we see, like awareness and even emotions in animals. So the individual neurons or groups of neurons cannot explain many of these emergence. So unexplainable today. The key part is today. That doesn't mean, there's a lot of research going on. So this may be, we may get better at explaining it. And one of the tools that is helping us is these AI models, because these AI models, at least today, have grown so large. And I don't want to give a comparable assessment in terms of the number of biological neurons, because it's not a very simple one-to-one correlation. It's not even a one-to-many correlation. There's many, many variables that are different enough. And each of these artificial intelligence systems are designed in different enough ways that you can't make a generalization to even a simple animal. But the idea that these artificial systems have grown up to or beyond a certain threshold, we're starting to see that in many of these systems. Many of the larger systems, which in artificial intelligence is a term called token, and there's also a term of the number of I'm not able to remember the exact phrase, but they basically embody. It has to do with the amount of training that they're given, that they're trained with, and the amount of information that they're trained with has the most recent systems have reached basically 1 trillion uh, quantums of information, you can say. And 1 trillion is a pretty large number. And again, I don't want to compare it to the multiple billions of neurons in animals, because you can't compare these numbers in the same way. But suffice to say, these artificial systems have grown to such a large scale that we're starting to see emergent behaviors which appear to be animal-like and in many cases human-like. So that's the gist of emergence. Here's another very simple pictorial representation. So here's a brain with just, again, we're only looking at a small set of clusters of neurons that work together to cause a specific behavior. This might be the ability to move a single finger on somebody's hand, right? And you have a bunch of neurons. And then you have more complex behavior where you have multiple regions within the brain that work together to give more complex behavior in the organism. And then all of the regions of the brain together work to give much more complicated behavior in that organism. In this case, it's a human brain. And the difference is that each of these successive increases in complexity in the brain allows us to see an emergence of complex behaviors. So let me just increase it. So as the complex behaviors emerge, and this is specifically in a human brain even, from a child. When a child is born, the first few days at its birth, its brain doesn't understand or doesn't, from what we can tell, it doesn't have a very coherent concept of things around it. It is basically doing a lot of things randomly. But over time, it starts to see patterns. It starts to see patterns in the people that come in front of that infant, and how those adults usually behave to them, or if they have siblings, those other children behave to that infant. These patterns and behaviors over time get embedded in that infant's mind, and the mind goes from a very, very simple mind to a little bit more moderate level of complexity. And as that infant grows into 2 years or 5 years or teenage years, the complexity increases much more, and you start to see much more complicated behaviors out of that infant. So in the beginning of the infant, and we know this in psychology, that there's this concept of the theory of mind, that right now there's this the assumption or the belief is that children younger than around 4 years of age don't have a theory of mind. What that means is that they don't understand, and they don't even have a notion that they have a brain, and especially that other people have a brain. And what that means is that because they don't have this notion of their brain and other people's brains being different, they don't understand that other people can have different thoughts separate from them. So young infants and young, even 2-year-old children, they tend to think that when they see an object, that the people around them are seeing that same object. They don't understand that that object may be hidden from someone else's sight. There may be an obstacle blocking that object for their parent, and the child can see that object directly. But a 2-year-old child, and this has been shown through many, many experiments, that 2-year-old child doesn't understand that adult has a separate brain, and therefore that adult might not have the same idea that they have. They don't understand that ideas are separate and distinct from in different people. So that's for example an example of a complex behavior. Again, it's not as complex as conscious, but it's one of the areas of complex behavior that in the animal world we see this progressing even within mammals, that at a certain point, certain mammals start to exhibit this awareness of other animals and other animals having brains, whereas smaller mammals, which have smaller cortical regions, it takes many more years to develop this understanding, or sometimes they never develop it. Some species of certain mammals never develop this because their brains are not have not reached this threshold that we talked about for that type of emergent behavior. So emergence in AI. So let's just go a little bit into. Actually, you know what? Let me pause. Let me pause here. Let's do question and answer just to see if everyone's following and if there's any, you know, I just want to get a sense of what people think about this so far. What do you disagree or agree, and what ideas do you have around this? Let's try to do that. If anyone wants to,
So if anybody wants to type exclamation point in the chat, please to ask Sanjay a question about what has been shared thus far. Go ahead and type exclamation point in the chat or raise your hand in Zoom. Mike.
The issue of one of the things that I've used in this thing is that there's a kind of a nonlinear multidimensional effect that goes on. If you take these one at a time, it's very hard to explain something, but the combinatorial effects are of issue. Reinforce each other, and that may be the method in the mind, the method in ChatGPT, and the method in the economy. Now, I have heard, you probably have heard too in some of your travels, that an individual ant is as dumb as dirt, but an anthill starts when it swarms, it builds straight line paths to the nearest picnic real quickly. And that's, it's hard to say whether that's a quantum effect like Penrose talks about, or is it, or is just a kind of random effect that somehow the random effects tend to reinforce each other. Another variable like that is what happens in how economies work. So these emergent effects are very important and can explain. Have you seen Conway's paper on the game of life?
yes.
That also very, very simple rules that are not even as smart as an ant create some very complex patterns. So now ChatGPT does amazing things. Even the Bing implementation of ChatGPT, which I don't think is ChatGPT 4 yet. Is it like a situation where what goes on inside, like you can simulate a very complicated process by a Taylor series or a Fourier series? You know that's not what's going on inside those things. There's not periodic things reinforcing each other, but it is it behaves exactly like a really complicated process, like a explosive lens in a fusion reaction, and how that reinforces each other and creates something that really does something. So I just wonder if that's if emergent properties are combinatorial and work in a reinforcing each other way and have nothing to do with how the brain works, but it can simulate how the brain works. I don't know. Somewhere in there's a question and a complicated answer, and I've delved pretty deep into those things, but I still don't understand. And maybe you can shed some light on whether this is that kind of combinatorial reinforcement.
Okay. Yeah. So and again, this is an area that is not understood by most people who've gone into who studied or gone into look at this in detail. It's an area that's controversial, and it's very difficult to prove. So what I'm saying is my understanding and belief and frankly opinion on this. I don't believe that emergence is combinatorial. Combinatorial applies to simple and complex systems. But the concept of emergence is actually, I don't want to say antithetical, but it's almost the opposite of what combinatorics has to do. Combinatorics has to do with the calculatable complexity of a system, irrespective of how complex the system is. If you had a biological brain that had, let's say, 1 trillion neurons, okay, 10 times what a human brain has, you could still use the rule of combinatorics to understand how information flows from groups of neurons to groups of neurons. And you can do the same combinatoric analysis in a much smaller brain. And the combinatorics analysis would explain both to some extent. But your combinatorics analysis would not explain emergent behaviors in the larger brains. And not only would it not explain it, it would not be able to see or detect whether emergent behaviors exist in the larger brain and don't exist in smaller brains. So combinatorics would not help you to understand certain aspects of behavior. So again, this is how I see it. I think when you were referring to combinatorial behaviors and combinatorial complexity, maybe you were talking about it in a different way. I'm not sure. I use the dictionary definition of combinatorics. Maybe you were using it in a more broader way. But I'm going to look at the example you gave of stochastic. I don't remember if you referred to it as stochastic processes or differentiable processes. And again, that is a combinatoric type of assessment of a system that, again, can't explain emergent behavior. So anyway, let me stop there. I'm not sure if I'm not sure if you had a question, but if you did, you'll let me know if I made any progress there or not.
I need to think about my question, my pseudo answer, and your answer, and maybe there's some thread to follow. So I'll go back to silence for a while. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. So next up we have Ian.
Okay. Hello. Okay. In terms of emergent properties, the gist of, I think, much of what you were saying was that that basically these properties, neurological properties, emerge with basically a certain number of neurons being accumulated. There's like a threshold for emergent properties as a function of gross number of neurons. Now, I wonder though if there have been some recent fascinating discoveries about some neurological processes. For instance, the idea that quite a bit of computation occurs among the spines within the dendrites alone, irrespective of neurotransmission over the entire neuron or between different neurons. So a question might be, for instance, since this interdendrital, if that's a word, computation presumably has a crucial role in human cognition, is this emergent property? Have they found examples of this computation, this neuroactivity confined within dendrites alone in other animals? Basically, is such an emergent property or itself does it give rise to emergent properties seen nowhere else except maybe humans or other primates, for instance?
Okay, yeah. So let me try to give a little bit of background on what your question is and what your point raised. So I think many people understand that every neuron has a dendritic tree, which actually accumulates and gets information from its neighboring neurons. And the dendritic tree basically coalesces and channels all of that information in some certain ways to the soma, to the cell body, after which there's you might say an activation function. The neuron kind of decides what to do with that information. Either it passes it on to the next neurons or next multiple neurons it's connected to, or it does nothing. It basically, the information stops there. So the dendritic tree is the apparatus through which a single neuron collects information from its neighboring world. And Ian, what you asked, or at least what I believe you asked, is based on, and I need to explain this because I suspect many people may not know this, that in this dendritic tree, there have been findings in the last around 10 years, and this is not only in human dendrites, this is also in animals that we've seen, especially larger mammals, that the dendritic tree actually shares information amongst each other, which we never thought happened. Now we know that it does happen to some extent. It's not pervasive, but it happens in many cases, in sufficient number of cases, that it's not simply that the dendrites are collecting information. They're collecting information. They're also kind of sharing information. You might see electrical impulses or biochemical signals, biochemical information amongst each other, after which they get passed on to the soma for that neuron to activate or do something. And Ian, I think you referred to it as interdendrital computation. And you can, I mean, that's a valid phrase. You can use a term like that. It makes sense to me, at least, in the sense that this information that the dendrites are collecting and they're passing on to each other, in a sense, you can say that that's computation. It would be very simple computation, but in theory, you can have an idea that that computation is sufficient on a single neuron level, that it helps the neuron to kind of, let's say, filter out, because a single neuron sometimes can get thousands of pieces of little information, bits of information, and for it to channel all of that through, and for it to be processed in the soma. And again, it's not. I'm making it sound much more complicated than it is. The neuronal cell body doesn't. It's not a very complicated way that it processes. But if some of that processing can happen in the dendrite itself, in the dendritic tree itself, it might simplify things. So that's where Ian is asking. I believe that's what you're asking. First, I don't think that, I mean, what you're saying, it may be happening, and it probably does happen more often than we were aware of in the past. But I don't think that is going to change the aspect of emergence, because the point you raised has to do more with the rules of how this information is categorized and processed in a single neuron. And emergence is not about a single neuron. Emergence is about a vast number of neurons. Like you said, after we reach a certain number of thresholds of neurons, that's when we start to see emergent behaviors come out of animal brains. And so I guess your analogy is that because dendritic trees can be quite large, on the thousands or even sometimes tens of thousands of spires, of paths and branches. So in one sense, you're saying or suggesting that there may be a threshold for this dendritic tree beyond which these computations within this dendritic tree, these computations start to emerge, or there's an emergence of more complex computation. I think this is where you're headed. I think that this was probably the gist of your question. And if it wasn't, if I'm reading too much into it, let me know. But I suspect that, or at least that's what I'm interpreting, that this dendritic tree, if it's large enough beyond a certain threshold, that its computations will cause an emergence of more complex computations that will help the single neuron. It's plausible, yes, but I don't think that the threshold that we're talking about for a dendritic tree would be in the tens of thousands of and again, the other side of this is that the computations that actually, I'm using the term computation very loosely because I don't believe that they would be characterized as very complex computations. So again, the number and the number of branches in the dendritic tree and the complexity of each computation, both of these are elements of what you're asking. And I think, combining this in my mind, the way I understand this, I don't think it would arise at the level of emergent behavior that, the topic is tonight. Emergent behavior we're talking about is much more complex behavior that is unexplainable given the rules of this, tiny area of the world, this dendritic tree.
So we have Michelle followed by David.
Thank you. So I've done a little bit of homework before this meetup, but I do admit I am quite a layperson in this topic of neuroscience in general. But my question is this. When I was doing my homework, I was looking through many different examples of emergence. The things that came up are the flight patterns of starlings. Obviously, neuronal behavior, right? The human brain, consciousness, even phase changes of water. And my mind kind of went to, okay, what is kind of like the simplest, most basic, elemental example of emergence? And I'm thinking, okay, numbers, right? It was believed that prime numbers have no pattern. But, of course, mathematicians love a challenge. So there have been, I believe, a few individuals or groups who have found what looks to be certain patterns. For example, you're not going to see that pattern with, say, a handful of prime numbers, 1, 2, 3, but if you get enough of those prime numbers and arrange them in a certain organized way, you'll see certain patterns emerge that kind of resemble like crystal formations. Now, my question is this, and it's kind of a two-part question, please forgive me. The first part of the question is, in reviewing these types of examples, I can't help but think that our concept or our perception of emergence is really subjective. Because, the properties of the thing, whether it's matter or numbers, those properties are already inherent, yet we observe them only when the complexity passes a certain tipping point, it seems, right? So just because we can't see something when the parts are fewer, it doesn't mean they're not there. So just because we start seeing them, we are now subjectively calling it emergence. So I think I'm just a little bit uncomfortable with that because it just seems so subjective to me. Like, okay, just because we don't have the tools or the technology or we don't have the scientific knowledge right now to see something, it seems mysterious to us, right? So we're just calling it emergence. Like if I don't know a lot of scientific history, but like a few hundred years ago, if let's say like Pasteur, okay, or someone else who didn't know why spontaneous life or germs and all that and fungi, like where all that came from, because they didn't have powerful enough microscopes, they might think, well, that's emergence. You leave bread out, it turns into green mold, that's emergence. So what is the difference between that, those scientists who didn't have the information at the time, so when they saw something, they called it emergence, versus us now? Do we think we know so much about our reality, our natural world, that we just have this new word called emergence? Instead, is that just another word of saying, I don't know?
Okay.
Would you like to respond?
Yeah. So I'm not sure you had a second part, but let me.
I do, but I kind of went for a while, so I did want to pause and also.
Thank you. Actually, yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank
Yeah, you can ask the second part later if after other people have asked, or But yeah, so very good question, and I think so. My again, this is my opinion, my belief, and I would say that there is something to emergence beyond simply that we don't know. And let me preface that to say by first saying that many things that people call emergence, I don't agree with. I think that they simply are aspects that we don't perceive, that we don't have the tools to observe, to measure quantitatively in the physical world, in dynamic systems. But similarly, there are other aspects of the world that we can measure at minute levels, but they don't exist. I'll give some examples. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to do justice to this, but let me start with something that I think should be simple. sand dunes. So we all have seen sand dunes. They form these undulating ripples over time and space, meaning these ripples shift over time, and these ripples occur over space, right? So sand dunes and sand dunes naturally occur. They're not created by organisms, or they're not created by the wind causing it. Actually, it's much more complicated than simply the wind. And sand dunes, the effect or the shapes of sand dunes formation, the way that they form, have many, many elements. And I'm not going to profess to understand all of the areas that go into it, but some of the areas that I know that shape them is the crystal structure of sand particles. Sand particles are basically quartz, and they're natural elements, but they have a crystalline structure. And the crystalline structure comes from the it's not metallurgical, but basically the
silica?
Excuse me?
The silica structure?
Well, I mean, if it's silica, yeah. I mean, all sand is not completely silica, but yeah, the crystalline structure of the silica molecule or whatever, I mean, the same thing applies to water. I was going to give another example, but the crystalline structure of the material that we're talking about emerges from the individual molecules and the shape of the molecules. And that the angles between the parts of the molecule have impact on the types of crystals that can form, the way that the crystals grow, the sizes that the crystals can be, the homogeneity of the crystal. Most crystals have fractures after a certain time, and the point at which fractures start to appear depends on a lot of these lower level characteristics. And all of these things put together end up with giving us small particles that we call sand particles. And so, net effect, if you took lots and lots of sand particles, millions and millions of sand particles, you start to assess them all in using these simple rules, you'll find certain patterns that these sand particles have. But they all are fairly small. They all would grow to up to a certain size. And when you put these sand particles on a flat surface, and if you exert forces on them, on Earth, usually it's wind. Sometimes it can be vibration from other sources, but usually it's wind. When that force causes these sand particles when the wind causes forces on these sand particles, it causes them to either coalesce together and even form structures, small structures on top of each other, in a three-dimensional sense. If you start off with a flat surface, over time you're going to see them bunched together into small mounds and structures. And as this progresses, and again, it depends also on the amount of friction that the surface is on. If you put these sand particles on a sheet of glass with very low friction, you won't see the same effect. So there's many, many compound effects that come together. Now, at the end of all of this, what ends up happening is that the way that sand dunes form, we really can't explain them fully today using the laws of, and we understand the laws of physics in fairly complex ways, but this is where we've looked at, we have the tools to look at individual sand particles as well as the motion of individual sand particles. Yet it's still very difficult for us to explain. We can build physics simulations of sand particles, and we still don't have a good grasp of how these sand dunes form. Now, in recent years, there have been better models that have given us more realistic pictures of it. So in that sense, part of what you're saying, Michelle, is that, what I heard your question ask is all of this notion about emergence not really there, and it's just another way of saying we don't know? That's what I heard you say. The answer I'm trying to give is, in my opinion, I think that for many things that's true, but not all things. I think there are certain things in which, even if we understand the properties of the individual elements and the types of interactions that happen between these elements, after a certain number of these elements come together, the types of interactions become so complicated that we can't understand them. We can't observe them, definitely, but we can't understand them. Now, it might be, now what this is saying is this is not ruling out determinism. Okay, this is maybe at the core of what you're asking are we discounting determinism? No, emergence still occurs and allows determinism. So I'm not sure if that was where you were going at.
Yes, so
you're on
yeah,
silent.
even within a deterministic reality, it would be obvious that emergence is there. And I do appreciate your answer about how not all of the examples that you find strewn about on the internet is true emergence in the strict kind of scientific definition of that word. And it's being kind of used really wildly everywhere because it's this kind of popular new thing. But yeah, and the other part of my question that I was
All right,
having trouble reconciling
Michelle,
was
could you actually, Michelle, could you
I'm
maybe
sorry.
hold off on the second part
Yes,
of the question? Yeah,
absolutely.
because we have other people and Sanjay still has a second part to get to. So I want to try and keep
Absolutely.
on target. Thank
Yes.
you. Good, David.
Okay, so Sanjay, we're talking about emergence, and as you're talking about sand dunes, so we don't predict sand dunes from the simple known chemical force models of the atoms that constitute sand, silicon oxide. We don't do that. It can't be done. You do real empirical science to figure out what the sand dunes are going to actually look like. You'd never build a building based on some model you get in a laboratory about what kind of sand duning is going to happen at the Atlantic City beach. It's impossible. It's not real. So here, when we're discussing, saying we're going to do some explaining about consciousness or thinking or behaviors, looking at what build up neural networks or what builds up neurons and consciousness, already sand is too complex and it's made out of what? 2 elements in the universe. Okay, so how would you characterize the degree of complexity of a neural network built out of silicon and gold and wires and charges, and B, a biological dendrite structure, which is 3D spatial chemical folding molecular structure, which grows molecule by molecule and is in a chemically immersed environment, interconnected with the other 100 billion that are just like that. In other words, what are we going to be explaining about thinking that has to do with human thinking from something that's a model that has to do with AI that's built out of pluses, minuses, and neural networks that get very complicated we can't explain in themselves? I mean, I'm not sure I can see an analogy. We can talk about things we give behaviors to. We print out answers, we make them jump and swirl and run around, and so we can see their behavior. Well, how are we relating this to thinking, consciousness, and humanity? Or is that not really the issue here? Because we can't explain sand dunes.
Yeah, so we're not trying to explain the emergence of behavior out of networks, out of neural networks. We can't do that. That's why we use this term emergence, because we realize that it's too complicated for us to explain. But what we're saying using the word emergence is that it emerges somehow. So in the backdrop of this idea of emergence is this word somehow that is important for us to realize.
And what Michelle said, I like that. Yeah.
And what Michelle said is she asked a valid question, and she challenged us in that, is all of emergence just somehow or an unknown, right? And I'm saying that there is a distinction. We have to draw the distinction that certain things are unknowns, but we don't. And some people do call it emergence, but that's not the emergence that in the scientific literature, at least, it refers to. In the scientific literature, there's a strong emergence and a weak emergence. So there's 2. If you delve into it, you'll see that. But what David just brought up is that. And at the beginning of this talk, tonight, I kind of prefaced by saying that this is such a vast topic, and that's why it's difficult for me to go into too many times, because this is what happens usually, is that we want to delve into the more intricate and detailed and complicated parts of it without having looked at the more mundane, more explainable parts of it. So I'm trying to go slowly, but everybody wants to go faster and delve in, and that's we're all intelligent. We all want to do that. We all want to delve in and not simply dwell on the simple parts, but we really have to understand. And when David was talking about even the simple things like sand dunes, we understand to some extent, but we really don't understand them. And that's the problem. So in this first talk, what I want to focus on is not the fact that we don't understand these things, but that's a given. We don't understand emergence, okay, especially when we're talking about neural systems. But what I do want us to look at is that the problem with emergence is that actually, I mean, that's not what I wanted us to talk about today. In part two, I'm going to go a little bit into it, is that let's try to get an understanding of all of these neural systems, whether they're artificial or biological, it doesn't matter, because at least in my experience and experience of most of the people who've been working in these two areas of neuroscience and artificial intelligence, all of the people who work in both of these areas say the same thing. They're saying that these systems are representing each other. They have a lot of similarities, and we're seeing emergent behaviors arise out of both of these systems in similar ways. Therefore, possibly the underlying aspects of them are the emergence are I don't want to say caused by, but somehow there's interrelationships that allow similar behaviors to emerge out of these very, very different systems where, AI is, as David said, it's basically, electronic systems, metal and silicon and chips. And brain is biochemicals and neurotransmitters and tissue, soft tissue. These are very, very different things, but they still, at a macro, large, really, really, really large scale, we're talking billions and trillions of representational units. On the billions and trillions of that scale, we start to see they exhibit a lot of similar properties. That's what I want us to focus on. Not that we can't explain why or how. We can't. Okay, that's a given. And we probably won't be able to for many years. But let's look at it from a macro point of view, that these systems, even though we can't explain the minutiae of it, we can't explain how they fundamentally are able to do all this. Looking at them on a macro scale, we see that they show similar behavior. And let's look at it from a top down to try to understand what it might be that's happening in these two systems that are very different. That's the approach that I'd like us to take for this, not just tonight, but for the exploration of this idea around neural systems and how complex behaviors arise out of neural systems. If we don't want to use the word emergent, doesn't matter. I use the word emergent because it helps people to understand this. But if it confuses things more for you, we don't have to use the word emergent. Anyway, so let's. I don't know if anyone else has a question.
Laura, and then we'll move on.
1 second.
You're unmuted, Laura.
I'm trying. Okay.
You are unmuted already. We can hear you.
Okay. You hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
I have a hard time asking this question because, as you know, Sanjay, I always like to take it down to and think about general, and there's all these components in the brain, and within that system, there's lots of different systems working and going through the processes of emergence and so. So let's say the brain gets jostled really hard, and these areas, the systems in these areas get all I don't know, jumbled, let's say, and they find themselves in different spaces. And so let's say, what happens then? Do the systems sort of try to find themselves aligning naturally in some way to form a new system that will emerge? And do these, and how does all of this, this is probably all stupid, but it'll all get to the to the brain to go out as a message, into the spinal cord to enter into the body. And so how does it then, also when it enters into the body, what happens with those systems? Do they look for other systems that are sitting out there already? maybe waiting for new systems to start to move the process on. And I think maybe you don't have an answer to that. Maybe it's a terrible question, but I just, want to know how it works, and is there some sort of hierarchy in the systems that actually get out into the spinal cord, to get sent out, because all of them can't go.
Sanjay?
Yeah. So you've raised a lot of ideas. They're important, but I'm not going to be able to give you an answer that will explain everything. So just starting with the initial question, the initial part of your question was that we have a brain that gets jostled in some way. And that jostling we can think of as in many different ways. So just there, depending on how we look at it, how the brain reacts and what happens subsequently in the brain will differ. So, and I'm going to use maybe terms that might not be clear, but I can explain them if you need. One type of jostling might be simply an impulse, a signal, a very short time frame signal that goes into the brain. Let's say a flash of light, okay? A flash of light in front of your eyes. And that flash of light will basically cause signals in your retina. It will propagate through in different parts of your brain into the visual cortex. It'll be processed in the visual cortex and will eventually reach out into the other parts of the brain and probably into your consciousness at some point. And that flash of light is a very, very simple type of signal. And in systems, I use the term impulse because there's such a thing as an impulse response. It's a very short burst, high amplitude type of signal, which a system has to react to. Every system reacts to signals that impinge on it. So depending on the response can be that the system originally, before this impulse response, this flash of light happened, the brain was in a certain state of existence. And the outcomes might be that the brain, after this flash, remains in that state, meaning this flash didn't really cause much. I'm talking long term, So during the initial flash, the processing, milliseconds to, let's say, 1 or 2 seconds later, there will be a response. But after those few seconds, the brain will come back to its quiescent state and it'll be back to normal, right? So nothing much will happen. But there's another situation where the flash of light may actually cause a problem in the brain. And we see this with people who have epilepsy. In certain cases, specific types of flashes, impulse signals, can actually cause their brain to go into seizure, or part of their brain to go into seizure. And this is, again, a human brain. And for all practical purposes, their brain is normal in every other sense except the fact that they have epilepsy, or their brain is prone to epilepsy. So this is an example where the jostling, there's many, many types of jostling that can occur. Another type of jostling may be that they see something that causes emotional reaction in them. It's either a positive or negative observance that they see around them that will cause reaction in them. And that reaction can either be quiescently processed and the brain will be back to normal, or it may cause a degradation in their brain, a short-term degradation, meaning their emotional state may either rise or fall depending on what they see. If it's a happy thing, probably their emotional state will rise. But that won't cause a long-term effect. But in some people, it could cause a long-term effect. So all these things, it's very complicated to talk about. When you're talking about the spinal cord, I would expand it not simply to the spinal cord, because the brain doesn't output only to the spinal cord. It actually outputs to our entire body. Our entire body is kind of the mechanism through which our brain communicates with the outside world. Even things like sweating, even things like the hair standing up on our skin, those are reactions that our brain can exhibit. For example, if we get afraid, the hair on our skin literally rises and gets alert. And so that's a response of a brain that's in fear. So our brain communicates using the entire body, not just the spinal cord. You asked a question that's very complicated. I'm not going to be able to go a lot into it, but maybe if you can narrow it down a little more, we can get to it at another time. Okay. But thank you. That's a very, very complicated question.
Thank you, Sanjay.
Okay, so Sanjay, since there are no other questions, why don't we just go to the second half of the presentation?
Okay, all right. So yeah, this will be shorter. I basically have just a few slides, but what I wanted to do is
Okay.
go into just the some examples of emergence that we're seeing in AI, and I want to use this as a springboard. And again, this talk we're going to have. This is going to be a multi-part talk. Hopefully, people remember. The people who attended tonight. Hopefully, they remember, and we can. I'll usually what I do is have a refresher at the beginning of the next talk. But my goal is that we try to understand these things and then go forward from from where we left out tonight. So let me go back to sharing my screen. I think this should have it should be shared at this point. If you can.
Yeah,
All
we
right,
can see most of it.
Okay. Yeah. So emergence basically. So the a lot of these examples that I'm going to give were seen as of 2022, and I have to say that because in 2022 the systems that we had were basically ChatGPT, GPT-3, PaLM, Google's model, Lambda, which is another Google model. These are now considered old systems. Even though we're not that far into 2023, those systems are considered older systems. They're considered less sophisticated systems. Systems that we have today are about an order of magnitude. In some cases, they're an order of magnitude larger and more complex, and they're showing much more emergent behavior. So what I'm describing here are ones that we saw in simpler systems. We're seeing many more complex behaviors, many more surprisingly complex behaviors in the newest systems that were introduced this year, that at least were publicly demoed this year. So I just want that to preface with that what we're describing here is a generation ago, and the newer generation systems are actually much more complicated and much more human-like, even though what we're going to see here, we're going to see that these older systems had a lot of human-like characteristics. So emergent knowledge of other cultures, of other languages that we saw in 2020 in these systems. So understanding of Bengali. Bengali is a language in India, and Hindu culture and Vedic math. Vedic math refers to ancient mathematics that was in India. So that these are aspects that came, and again, you have to keep in mind that these systems were not specifically trained in these. These systems were trained taking not all, they took a vast amount of information off of the internet. And they were trained in this information. I won't go too much into some of the videos and some of the references in for tonight's talk. You should access. They will give you a better understanding if you don't have a good understanding of it. I went through and found the ones that I think will give the best explanation and try to help understand. They're not only on emergence, they're on AI and the convergence of AI and neural networks and neural systems. Brain versus natural brain versus biological versus artificial brain. So the ability to understand these foreign languages, transliteration of international phonetics and alphabets. So there are many cases where the system was not trained specifically in even knowing that there were all these different languages. So for example, when you go on the internet, and most of us, when we go on the internet, we go on the English part of the internet. We really don't go on the foreign parts of the internet, although they're there. They are there, and you can go on there. But normally, because you're clicking from link to link, most of the links that we have on web pages don't point to links on these other parts of the internet, which are in other languages, but they are all there. So when they trained these AI models, they didn't limit it only to the English part of the internet or the World Wide Web. Not what most of us think of as the internet is actually the World Wide Web. The internet is a whole different animal. It's much more complicated than simply the World Wide Web. So they took information from vast areas of the World Wide Web that were non-English also, and they put it in there. But during training, they basically ignored all of these other areas. They didn't do much with them. Okay. And so the training focused on the English aspects, the English knowledge that the people involved in these companies they themselves mostly worked in English, so they attract English. And to some cases, they may have gone into other languages, languages they're familiar with, French or other languages, and they did some one-shot experimental integration of the systems, and the systems seem to understand French because, as you'd expect, there's much more French on the internet, on the World Wide Web, than there is some more remote languages like Swahili and Bengali. But basically, these systems had within them, encapsulated within them, many of these other languages, but the amount of information in these other languages was very sparse, was very low. But here's the emergent part. Even though the amount of Bengali language or Swahili language was very, very low, and in the third bullet here, I describe Swahili proverbs. So the number of Swahili proverbs that were in these systems were very, very low. I can't give you an exact number, but they were not in the hundreds, in many cultures, there are several hundred proverbs that typically are there. So these systems may have had a small number, 5, 10, 15 maybe, proverbs that randomly kind of got in there, and they were there. And again, nobody knew that they were there, and therefore nobody was doing anything about it, but the system, it was there in one sense. What happened, and here's the emergence part of it, is that after these systems were fully developed and put out into the world for people to use, people started, somebody who had a knowledge of Swahili might have put in a prompt about a Swahili proverb. And this system actually, what they found was it actually translated and it understood what the proverb meant, even though the amount of information it had to really understand it was minimal. And what that means is, and if we try to, distill down exactly this specific case of the emergence of its understanding of Swahili proverbs in English, if we try to distill this down, what may have happened, again, we can't say what happened because they haven't gone into the systems to delve in. It's very difficult to go in and look at that level. But what appears to have happened is that it had these few proverbs there, and it had knowledge of translating Swahili to English, and it had knowledge of English proverbs, and it combined these three things together and gained an ability to understand and interpret Swahili proverbs. Now, the problem is that how does it know what is a Swahili proverb and what isn't? If you don't tell it, if it has 175 billion pieces of information, how does it know out of those 175 billion pieces of information, these 40 pieces of information refer to Swahili proverbs? 40 out of 175 billion is such a small fraction that for this system to basically be able to use those 40 and the knowledge out of all the other emergent behavior that came out of it, for it to be able to hone in on these 40 and use it in such a sophisticated way that it recognizes these as a single concept of a single language, and then to be able to associate it with the concept of a proverb, and then to associate that proverb and translate it into English. I mean, each of these are advanced behaviors for a child, right? Using the analogy of children being simpler animals, right? Simpler human beings. So each of these aspects are pretty complicated in and of themselves. But these last generation 2022 systems were able to do this. One of the systems was able to do this. Other systems could not. And what that says is that there's something about that particular system and the type of training it received, not in Swahili, because it didn't receive any training in Swahili. It received training in other things that helped it to kind of figure out that here's a proverb, it happens to be in the language Swahili, and when a person who was a Swahili speaker asked a question, it associated, almost magically, it associated these information and gave an answer which gave it the ability to translate a Swahili proverb. So that's an example of emergent behavior. And again, yes, we don't understand it. And I'm not saying that because we don't understand it, it's not emergent or it is emergent. The concept of emergence shouldn't matter here. What's important for us to look at is that the ability of this system to do something that not only was it not trained to do, but it was not even remotely given awareness of the pieces of information that it has to have. It has to have knowledge of what a proverb is. Now, it does have knowledge of what a proverb is in English, so that it has. But a proverb in Swahili, and I'm assuming, I don't know for sure, but I know proverbs in Indian languages I know, don't always match the context and the linguistic style of proverbs in English. So you can't assume that because it understands what a proverb is in English, it will automatically be able to reuse that knowledge in another language. That doesn't always work. So for this system to take this few tokens, in my example, I'm saying 40 tokens, but nonetheless, it's a very small number compared to 175 billion, a very small number of tokens of information about Swahili proverbs that it had, using that tiny number of information for it to extrapolate and add on all these other understandings or interpretations is pretty advanced behavior. Again, we don't have to call it emergent, but it's advanced behavior. And it's not simply that it did it once, it did it in multiple different areas, and then it chained them together into almost like a reasoning behavior reasoning, which was, which is confounding to us. Now, the reasoning aspect we see in many, many aspects of these systems. These systems seem to exhibit what we call reasoning, although I don't believe that they're actually doing reasoning the way that human beings and animals do reasoning. I don't think they're at that level. Not to say that they cannot. They will be able to do that eventually. But these systems today have not been de novo been trained in the aspects of reasoning. They kind of have come up with their own de facto way of reasoning because of the way that language on the internet exists. Language on the internet, whenever it's spoken and when it's written, it's always written using reasoning. Like, when you read a paragraph on the internet, like, for example, if you read a well-written document, that well-written document has embedded within it logic and reason. We learned in English class that when you write an essay, you start with an idea, you elaborate on the idea, in the next paragraph, you go into a different topic that might be related or might not be related. And the third paragraph, you might tie the first two together. So there's a structure and a reason and a set of logic that a writing encompass, which these systems can basically pick up on. Now, they're not picking up how to do logic and reasoning, but they're seeing that our language has reasoning built into it. And therefore, they're able to mimic these similar types of reasoning when they communicate using writing. That's something that's important for us to understand, that these systems aren't trained in everything that they exhibit, but they're picking up through our writing many of the aspects that we see them then exhibit. Another part is, and as we're talking about mathematics and logic, so they can detect logical fallacies. And again, they're not trained specifically in logic. Okay, some of these systems are, but typically they're not. Typically, they scrape lots and lots of information, and throughout that information, yes, there will be websites that talk about logic, and there will be other websites that talk about logical fallacies. But to this system, the types of logical fallacies that it was able to come up with were quite advanced. And again, we can't explicitly say that it wasn't already written somewhere, that it didn't simply take out of the written information off of the internet, off of the World Wide Web. But you have to remember that these systems are not simply reading and memorizing or reading and understanding. They're not doing that. They're really not. The reason why they're called large language models, I'm going to talk about this in a few minutes, but this is an aspect of these AI systems that we need to understand, at least the ones we have today. The ones we have today really don't understand things. What they understand is language. That's it. They understand language at a very advanced level, but they don't really understand the world. They don't understand things in the world. They don't even understand what the language is talking about. If the language is talking about a part of speech, if the system doesn't have an extensive library that helps explain to it the various parts of speech in multiple languages, if it does not have that, it can still use the phrase parts of speech without understanding it, and it will still use it correctly because the dictum and the structure of our written language that exists on the World Wide Web uses it in the correct way. And so it mimics that way of using it without understanding it. This is one of the things that we see in the system, is that it uses phrases and ideas that it really doesn't understand. So that's an important, at least the systems today. You know, and in the future, a year or 5 years down the road, these systems will be trained in much more sophisticated ways. They'll grow and they'll be expanded in much more ways, and those abilities will be added into them to understand more how we teach a child in kindergarten to think logically about things. These systems will be trained in those ways also. So again, detection of logical fallacies, Vedic mathematics, linguistic puzzles, metaphors, understanding of metaphors. And there was an example of emoji. There was a prompt given to one of these systems where it was given 4 emojis. Okay, first emoji was of a woman's face, and then there were 3 other emojis of a type of fish, a specific type of fish. And it was asked, what does this mean? And the simpler system, and they gave the same prompt, these 4 emojis, as the input into the system. You know, you're telling it this, okay, the 4 emojis. And the simplest systems really didn't understand. They kind of gave random, strange answers. The more modern systems kind of tried to say something. Well, it has something to do with a person and fish, and you know, it gave a kind of an answer, but it really wasn't very very understanding of what. And one of the more complicated systems, when it was given this prompt, its answer was the movie Finding Nemo. Right? And that's exactly what that emoji referred to. And just by looking at these emojis, okay, and remember that even if you go on the internet and you look at all of the, on the World Wide Web, and if you look at all of the various uses of emojis, the chances of it being able to understand or even see those exact 4 same emojis, chances are that nobody used those exact same 4 emojis. But even if someone did, the number of instances of those emojis appearing would be so few that this system would not be able to derive, or even a person, if you take a person, if you show them these 4 emojis for the first time, they probably would not be able to figure out or even be able to have a sense of what it's referring to. Yet the more advanced systems here were able to. That's the level of sophistication that we're seeing in these systems. Anyway, on this slide, So and I'm not going to go into this last one, but human morality, concept around human morality, we're starting to see, and this is very sparse, it's not that advanced, but we're starting to see, for example, fables, and this is again with Swahili proverbs. Proverbs are not fables, but there's an interrelationship between them. Fables have to do oftentimes with morals, morals that our human communities embody and want to teach to children and each other. So this is an aspect that we're starting to see, that some of these systems last year were starting to be able to interpret these fables and kind of grasp at or try to, you know, were able to, in some sense, understand that they had to do with morality and what aspects of morality they were you know, raising. So these are examples of emergent things that we saw. Here are some other things which are even harder to explain. And I put these because these, you know, we'll have to discuss much later. These are much more advanced areas, but classifying the toxicity of speech, not just detecting the toxicity, but classifying the levels of toxicity in something that the system is given. It's given a paragraph or a sentence, and it's able to assess the amount of toxicity. Now, toxicity is a very vague phrase, okay, because toxicity can refer to so many subtle interpersonal dynamics that the system would have to understand for it to be able to assess, you know, different elements of toxicity. So that's an example. Another example is that these systems showed consistently the ability to do addition and subtraction of 4-digit and 5-digit numbers. Now, again, you have to keep in mind that these systems, they learn things using, when they're given replicate knowledge in the same domain. So if this system was given millions of 4-digit numbers being added to other 4-digit numbers, if it was given millions and millions and millions of combinations of these, okay, it would be able to eventually figure out. Now, it doesn't have to be taught how to add or subtract. It doesn't have to be taught that. It simply has to be given examples of a 4-digit number with another 4-digit number added, another example of the same, another example of them being subtracted, and repeat this over and over millions and millions of times. This repetition of examples is how they're trained. Okay, and that's how they pick up. Now, the problem with 4-digit and 5-digit numbers is that if you scour through the web, the World Wide Web, you're not going to find that many examples where you have completely random type or even very disparate types of 4-digit, 5-digit numbers. Okay, you will find that many of them are patterns. For example, the number 10,000, or the number 100, 00100, or the number 0. Right? You'll start to see that many of those examples on the World Wide Web actually deal with very simple numbers: 10,000, 50,000, right? Those are 20,000. You know, these are numbers that we deal with often, and they're all over the internet. The number 49,216, probably, I'm sure it is on the internet, but it would not be on the internet millions of times. Yet these systems, you can give it any 5-digit, any 2 5-digit numbers, and not 100% of the time, but almost all of the times, it will give you the correct addition or subtraction of these 5-digit numbers, okay? Which is telling us that somehow using fewer examples and poorer examples of 4-digit and 5-digit numbers, using a small subset of examples, it was able to figure out the way of adding any 5-digit to any 2 5-digit numbers, which think of a child being able to do that, right? If a child is not given enough examples, if they're only given 3 numbers, right? 2 sets of 5-digit numbers, another 2 sets, another 2 sets, right? Would they be able to extrapolate from 3 sets how to do any type of 5-digit addition? They probably would not. But that's on the order of what these systems have been able to do. Using a very small number of information that they've been given, they've been able to extrapolate very complicated behaviors. And this last bullet here, the few shot, and I'm not going to go into this, this is a much more technical area of this area, but this is really where we're seeing things that can't be explained by anybody. Few shot refers to the concept that, again, we talked about the number of examples that a system has had. Few shot is referring to that. It's not simply the number of examples, but a few shot also is that it can be told by the person who's using the system. So if you're using ChatGPT, if you're typing in information into ChatGPT, you can type a sentence telling it something. Okay, so few shot refers to a few instances of a sentence or a few instances of an idea that you give it. Few being 1, 2, 3, not 10. Okay, few is a small number in the single digits. So these systems show that through telling them a small number of information about a knowledge domain, they're able to extrapolate using the other knowledge that they've pulled out from the web, using all of the other knowledge, and they take these few little pieces of information about something that they have no knowledge of. They merge these together and have some level of understanding of a novel idea, and that seems phenomenal. I won't give examples of those because they're a little more complicated to explain and understand. But anyway, so let's. I'm going to stop here, and let's. It's 10:40. I'm going to try to wrap up for tonight. But if we have any questions or comments that people have, things you want to share, I think Michelle had another part to her question. If she wants to ask that, we can go into that.
Michelle, why don't you finish your question? We'll go to Ian after that.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so the second part of my question, it kind of stemmed from, I had recently come across a really fascinating topic I guess in the topic of consciousness and really the hard question of consciousness. And I'm not very knowledgeable about this, but the Roger Penrose's, and I forgot the other person's name, but their theory of orchestrated objective reduction, I believe. So where one of the key takeaways for me was that instead of the activity of interest where consciousness may be emerging out of, instead of it being in the synapses, so between the neurons, that model theorizes that it may come from within the neurons. in the microtubules, because there are fractal type of structures built by the microtubules that have certain, quantum mechanical capabilities, I guess, if you will. So that led me to kind of question, okay, what if we're not looking at things? Okay, even if we think we see everything, we see all the little minute parts, the incremental parts, what if we're not looking at things from the right vantage point? We're not measuring things the right way. So it's giving us maybe the illusion that we are measuring things, but maybe we're just not measuring it in the way that would explain things. And then in that case, would emergence basically become a it would just disappear, because now we would be knowing how things are actually being, like we would understand the phenomena of emergence to the point where the mystery would be gone. I don't know if I posed that question clearly, but yeah, I was really interested in the orchestrated OR model and how emergence ties to that. Thank you, Sanjay.
Okay, yeah, so I let me just give a little bit of background on the question that you asked with Roger Penrose and his view on the topic. So, and I think some people may already be familiar with it, but I just want to make sure everyone starts with a known slate, so we're all understanding exactly what the idea is. Roger Penrose is a physicist, a quantum. He's a theoretical physicist, and I don't. First, let me just say very, very clearly that I don't agree with this theory that he's proposed. One, he doesn't have a strong enough background in the neurosciences. He really doesn't understand the areas that he's talking about. I'm not saying he's not smart. He's very smart, but and I've watched several interviews by him speaking on this specific topic, and it's clear to me that he is not saying that this is an answer. He's asking questions. That's the first thing we have to understand, is he's asking questions, because yes, he is a genius. There are many geniuses in the world, but that doesn't mean that he can't be wrong. Geniuses can be wrong also in areas that they don't have sufficient understanding. And when he raised this idea around microtubules, it came up. He elaborated with it in the interviews that somebody asked him a question and suggested to him this thing about microtubules, and he went on this, and he really he delved into it a little bit, but not sufficiently. And I'm surprised that he didn't delve into it sufficiently, because if he had done this, he would have realized this one aspect, which kind of explains why microtubules can't be at the crux of what he's trying to propose. So the idea that he's trying to explain around consciousness is that consciousness in the brain arises by these structures, these physical structures, these molecular structures that every neuron has, especially in the axon, which are known as microtubules. And basically, a simple way to think of them is they are long fibrous strands, and an even more visual explanation of them is that you might think of them as a long fibrous tube. In some cases, they're not a tube; they're simply a strand. Other cases, they're a hollow tube, like a garden hose. But nonetheless, they're microtubules. Okay, that's what they are, and they run along the length of an axon of a neuron. Now, the combined idea that he had, that somebody else suggested to him, and then he expounded on, was that these microtubules. What actually happens is that these microtubules are very important in neurons, and very important in the signal transduction along a neuron, meaning the flow of information through a neuron. So they're important in information flow. So he thought maybe this is important in consciousness, because consciousness is all about information flowing through the brain. Information is required to flow in a brain. We didn't get into this too much tonight, but I've talked about this in other talks, that information is fundamental to what the brain does, and all neural systems do. So information flowing through a single neuron is fundamentally reliant on microtubules. That's true. But, and this is where the leap happened, where he made a leap. he said, and the microtubules are some of the smallest structures. They're not the smallest, but they are some of the smallest structures that embody information flow in a neuron. So his idea was that these smallest microstructures maybe are somehow related to information flow, therefore consciousness. Now, yes, all of that makes sense up to this point, but then he took the leap by saying that quantum effects, because his specialty is quantum physics, quantum mechanics. That's his specialization. And he conjectured that quantum effects on microtubules is what's responsible, or not, he didn't say is what, but he said maybe that is somehow related to influencing or causing, or somehow related to consciousness. Might be plausible. You might say yes, makes sense. It could be. We'll have to look into it. The problem is that he knows this, that quantum effects don't occur on molecular scale. A microtubule not only is a molecular scale, it's a huge molecule. And even if you restrict it only to a small section of the microtubule, because a microtubule basically is a polymer, it's a chain. It's a chain of a molecule repeated over and over and over. So even if you take a single piece of the molecule, and it's a complex molecule, even if you take a single piece of that complex molecule, you still will not see quantum effects at that scale. Quantum effects are below the angstrom scale. Okay, microtubules are micrometers in size. The physics doesn't match up. Okay, that's the simplest way I can explain it. Is no, and it might be that he doesn't. And maybe because I haven't heard him push on this idea subsequently. In the first year or so, he pushed on it several times, and now I don't see him talking about it. So maybe he learned more about it and realized, I'm not sure why, but I don't see him pushing this idea anymore. But frankly, I don't think that that's going to explain it. Anyway, I'm not saying that he's totally wrong, but looking at the effects, anyway, somebody raised something else about quantum effects in the chat. We can go into that if you ask a question, but I'm not going to. Yeah, quantum effects are very complicated, and yeah, they can't explain consciousness by themselves.
Okay, so let's kind of stay on pace here. So we'll go with Ian, followed by Madeline, and then we have Vanessa, followed by Martin.
Okay, brief comment and then an idea for Sanjay to entertain. First comment is I'm going to maybe try to take on the mighty Roger Penrose, a mind vastly superior to my own, that we're going to entertain the idea that somehow consciousness is tied to quantum effects within microtubules. The problem is that all our cells are shot through and through with microtubules. Among other things, centrioles and the centromeres that are pivotal in chromosomal division during mitosis. So basically, if you want to tie consciousness to microtubules, then, like I said, there are cells, which of course might lead one possibly to extrapolate that somehow consciousness inhabited all our cells. We go down the road toward panpsychism. So suggesting that that might be a foil to Penrose's idea. And the other comment is basically concerning back to AI and the like. Sanjay was talking about these incredible examples where very tiny data sets were used by these systems to deduce complex things like Vedic math and the like. But entertaining idea of what happens, of course, if it has a huge data set. For instance, concerning Swahili. Swahili is a pidgin, lingua franca in East Africa, which, among things, has a very heavy Arabic base. Things like, like the word kitabu for book from Arabic kitab, book. Now, we were to mention the idea that perhaps the AI system, having no knowledge of Swahili, but say was granted the full English database. You might entertain the thought that perhaps a system like this could, as English itself is shot through and through with many Arabic words like, syrup, sugar, zero, cipher, chemistry, and the like, imagine the thought that maybe a system could basically mine English for Arabic terms, match them up with Swahili terms, and then mining English poetry, for instance, for use of metaphors like sugar and sweet means love or lust or the like, maybe use that to then translate some Swahili poetry or metaphors, for instance. And of course, we could do even better if it actually had access to the Arabic internet, for instance. So just the idea is that entertain the thought of what these things can do. They have the humongous database. And in fact, truly, when you think about this, while we may balk the idea these things are conscious, of course, there's no evidence for that, despite the Google engineers' claim, or much of the panic these days. Nonetheless, we can't, with our minds, roam through a thing like the entire internet, of course. But one of these systems could, and possibly do these deciphering feats of which I speculated, for instance. So even the things are not conscious, in a fundamental sense, they might be considered to be super intelligent simply by dint of having access to so much data at once, far beyond our capabilities. So.
Yeah, so I mean, when you talked about centromeres, they're not. That's an aspect of mitosis which doesn't get into actual behavior in the brain. I mean, if a neuron divides, it's dividing. It's not really processing information while it's dividing. So again, that wouldn't even come to play. Microtubules are complex structures that actually exist in many parts of the cell, not just in neurons. When a cell divides in mitosis, microtubules are another set of structures which actually cause the cell to separate and pull itself apart, pull the DNA, the genome into two strands and pull them apart. So literally, they're acting as strings pulling apart the two halves of the cell, after which it divides. Mitosis complete. So microtubules are complex things used in many, many areas. They're also part of our muscles. So microtubules are all over our body. Why don't we have consciousness in our muscles? Okay, you might ask that if microtubules really, so the microtubule side of it, I'm not going to go into. I can explain a lot more behind why they would not cause these types of things, but the topic tonight is not of consciousness. And I see what we're kind of delving into that, even though that's the long-term goal of everything we're talking about, is try to understand consciousness, because it is so difficult to understand. What you mentioned, Ian, about inferences. So the example you gave with Swahili language, this system translated English, you thought maybe there's an intermediate language, for example, Arabic, that it might associate with, because there are links between Swahili and Arabic. But if you think about it from the point of view of this system, these systems are not really designed to make inferences between vast areas of knowledge that it doesn't already know that are linked. For it to do what it's doing in that case, again, what you're doing is conjecture, and that's good. We can do conjecture to try to understand why is it that this happened in the system. But if you look at what this system is actually doing, okay, what these large language models actually are doing, they're the first video, I think it was the first video in the references that I linked to, which does a very good job of explaining what large language models do. And fundamentally, what they're doing is they are a autocomplete on steroids. Okay, that's the simplest way that you can think of a large language model. When you type in a prompt, what it does is it looks at the words in your prompt, and it takes it figures out the keywords in your prompt, and it gets at a knowledge domain that the question relates to. And then it tries to think of the first word that refers to that knowledge domain in terms of an answer. It thinks of the first word, then inside of its mind, if you want to think of it that way, inside of its processing unit, it puts out this first word as a potential response. And then it thinks out what would be a meaningful second word, given the rules of this language and given the rules of the knowledge that it has, what would be a meaningful second word. So it's trying to autocomplete a sentence, word by word by word. That's literally what it's doing, except it's not doing it by word, it's doing it by something called a token, which is a smaller part of a word. I won't go into that, but it's basically building a sentence item by item by item until it gets at something, and then it believes. And then there are other parts of the system which do some checks on it to see if it has coherency, if it's against the rules of, let's say, hate speech and things like that. There's some other further down checks that the system is made to do. And then if everything passes, it spits it out and says, this is my answer to you. Okay, that's basically what these systems are doing. These systems are nothing, they're basically doing autocomplete. So if you think of that from that point of view, if it's taking a Swahili proverb and it's doing autocomplete, that autocomplete, what you're saying, Ian, is it would have to bring in knowledge of Arabic poetry into this. And it might, it's possible, but for it to do that, it would have, and we have to remember, the prompt is in English. Nothing about the prompt says Swahili other than there might be the word Swahili in it. Okay, so the presence of the word Swahili is probably the only thing, because the person may have written, can you translate this Swahili proverb into English? Okay, and they give a proverb which the system has never heard of it. Okay, but it successfully did it. That's the surprising part. So the word Swahili is there, and that's the only thing that refers to this small, tiny domain of knowledge that it doesn't even realize it has, that has to do with these Swahili proverbs. And then the rest of that sentence that you give it the prompt, it kind of miraculously interprets in the language of Swahili. And you're saying here maybe it might be using Arabic, but if you think about it, internal to it, for it to do that, it would be multiple leaps of inference. It wouldn't just be one inference. It would be making inference upon inference upon inference to be able to accomplish this. And if it was doing this, you can take the alternate viewpoint that if it's taking these multiple inferences, chances are that it's not only taking these 4 or 5 inferences, it's taking similar inferences in other directions. Because the system is not just taking one train of thought. I mean, in a sense, what we do is we have a train of thought. These systems don't have a train of thought. They have a probabilistic hierarchy of words. Okay, and you can kind of say that's a train of thought, but it's not the same thing. So using these probabilistic structures of words that it comes up with, that upon which it builds an answer that it shows you, it gives you, these probabilistic structures wouldn't only go in the direction that you want it to, it would go in all kinds of other directions. Okay, inside of its mind, if you want to call it that, inside of its processing systems, it's going in many directions, some of which are completely wrong. So for it to consistently make inferences in the right direction, and the answer to be in that direction, that's what's surprising about it. If the system really didn't understand that all of these knowledge areas are interlinked, then it would make inferences in random or other directions mistakenly. And so the answers it gives might link it to another language which is very rarely known, and the answer and the interpretation of the proverb might push it into a totally incorrect answer then, and then the answer it gives would be wrong. But it doesn't do that. Usually it actually goes in the right direction. So it's difficult to explain that because I don't have access to, I don't think they've done an analysis of that specific case because it is so difficult to do. But these systems, overall, these systems are doing things that don't make sense given the way that they're designed. They're not designed to make multiple inferences, yet it seems to be doing that.
Madeline, you're next. And then I'm actually going to try and, I have a question myself that someone else is raising as well. So I would like to ask.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Sanjay. It's an incredibly complex subject and beautifully presented. So several things strike me. One is that it really is too bad that we don't have it in our language to denote doing things without agency. Because that is where we keep getting stuck in the discussions about AI. And I've noticed that you keep trying to find ways to talk about it that don't promote the idea of agency, and it's very, very difficult. I also really appreciated the way that you pointed out earlier that it doesn't understand what any of it means. And I think, my extrapolation from that is simply because it's not somaticized. You know, it will never have a frame of reference like that. I also wanted to address Michelle's point, which I think was somewhat similar to what David had put in chat earlier.
Mhm.
Are there truly emergent levels that are unpredictable based on what the simpler components are? Or is it simply that we can't predict them? And I think that it's not really an answerable question, because you could always say that any type of emergence that's unsolved in the sense of being unpredictable is simply something that we don't know how to predict yet. And there's no way for us to get far enough outside of the system to say, yeah, it's just because we don't have the tools to solve this yet. We're never going to be able to get there. So I'm going to go with some things are truly emergent and some may be eventually predictable. But we may be left with a handful of things that are just really truly emergent that we will never be able to figure out, because they're inherently unfigureoutable and unpredictable.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. Yeah, I think most things, many things are that we call emergent today are not, but there are some things that definitely are. And the things today, out of the block of things today that we consider emergent, some of those things we may later realize are not emergent because our ability to understand very complex things, ultra complex things, increases in the future. So it's yet to see whether neural systems fall within that area or not. It's too early.
So, if I may, Sanjay, and I think that the only reason why I'm going to pose this question is it was posted in one of the videos that you had given us as far as review. And I know you didn't go into great detail, but there was a mention of it as well in the chat. And given there has been, it's a very complex topic with so many different areas that we can go down. And I was just wondering, so that maybe if you could talk about the distinction between AI alignment and emergence, because I think by talking about the distinction between those two approaches may give us some ideas as to the limitations of emergence theory and also AI, what AI alignment is and the limitations in that particular area. And if there's any kind of mathematical approach to AI alignment at all. Definition anyway.
Okay, yeah. So great, very good question. So
I just think it'll help bring context. That's the reason why I'm asking that.
Yeah. And again, this topic is so broad that the videos that I chose were also meant to kind of expose people to different areas of this. And we're not going to, I know we're not going to be able to talk about all of it. This is a very important part. And I saw in chat also this was raised. So alignment refers to the idea that, and many of us have seen this already, where we've seen the lack of alignment in the sense that we've seen these AI systems, ChatGPT and others, when you ask it a question, it will give you an answer. And the answer seems correct. The answer seems so sure. And then later on, if you check or somebody else checks, they find out that it's actually false. The answer that I gave is false. And the AI system presented in such a sophisticated way with logical conclusion, etc., that you would think, how could it be wrong? But in many cases, not every case, but many cases, these systems are completely wrong. There was one in one of the videos that I posted with a 60-minute interview. The interviewer, and he was at Google. He was talking specifically about the system called BARD, which is an extrapolation of Google's Lambda system. BARD is just a wrapper around Lambda. It's not a system. It's not an AI system. It's simply a It's simply Lambda with a new interface added onto it, which ties into the internet. And the interviewer, the 60 Minutes interviewer, asked the system about a topic and give me 5 books on the topic. And the system gave out 5 books and bulleted, and the bullets, a single sentence summary of each of the books, what they were about, the title and the summary. It looked very impressive. Later on, the interviewer tried to find those books, and he said none of those books are real books. They don't exist. The system basically made them up. Okay? So some people might say that's creativity. Okay, but I think that's probably we're making an excuse for the system. It wasn't trying to be creative. The system doesn't differentiate between creativity and honesty and other aspects of it. Today, these systems don't. So alignment is a word and a concept and an ability that is required and is being added into these systems by the designers, the human designers of these systems, to align the behaviors of these systems with humanity, with our societal norms and rules, with ethics, with what we expect these systems to do. We expect them to be honest and truthful. We expect them, if they're not honest and truthful, if they're being, if they're being creative, to admit, I'm being creative. Let me be creative and give you 5, books that might exist. Instead of saying these are 5 books, it could say, here's my creative guess at 5 books that might exist, and it'll list 5 books. But then it's clear it's guessing, or it's being creative. But it doesn't do that. These systems today give answers as if it doesn't differentiate in any way between an honest answer and a truthful answer. And I think the reason is because it doesn't know the difference. And if you understand how these systems operate as an autocomplete, and it's a little more complicated than a simple autocomplete. It's an autocomplete with some bits of knowledge in certain domains that are interlinked, and that's where the probability comes in. It's a sophisticated probabilistic autocomplete that has knowledge about that has seen evidence of written human knowledge. Doesn't mean it understands the knowledge. It's only seen written versions of that knowledge. So alignment is where we want these systems to behave in ways and comply with these rules that we have for each other in society. We want these systems to follow the same rules. For example, don't insult another person. Don't be condescending, or don't use language that's demeaning. Don't use hate speech. Right? These are all rules that we have. But these systems, or don't be biased, don't be racist, don't be sexist. We all have rules that we know as we grow up and become adults. We learn these rules, but these systems, early the version of the systems didn't know these rules. And the language on the internet, not only did it not teach it these rules, the language on the World Wide Web actually didn't follow these rules. You'll find many racist things on the internet and all over the World Wide Web. And that's the reason why these early systems were exhibiting racist behaviors, because they were simply a reflection of everything that humanity had put onto the World Wide Web. And likewise, other biases that we have in our societies are in the web. So alignment is a process, and there are tools that researchers are trying to build into these systems to get them to align with human rules and human values and human behavior. That's the short version of it. It gets into a lot more complicated, because how do you do that? Not only how do you do it, let's say you do it, how do you test to make sure the system is truly aligned to those rules? Because how do you encapsulate and embody certain rules? For example, how do you define what is racist or what is sexist? Even human beings have difficulty understanding that. It's difficult to explain to another human being that you're being racist. They'll say, no, I'm not. Right? So if you can't do that between 2 human beings, how can we do that to a system that's artificially, not thinking yet? It's mimicking aspects of behavior. So alignment is a very, very complex area in and of itself. But the simple version is that we need these systems to follow our rules, our human rules. And these systems will not emerge. The alignment will not emerge. They have to be added in, because if they could emerge, they would have to emerge out of the knowledge on the World Wide Web that's there, and it isn't there. The actual opposite is there. The World Wide Web has the opposite of alignment embedded within it. So we learned over the last 3 or 4 years that it won't emerge out of the data set that humanity has created already. we have to add in layers on top of these systems. We have to add in, basically what's done in alignment is that when the system is created, there's a smaller system, 2 or 3 or 4 different smaller systems, AI systems, that are created to kind of cross-check and double-check and triple-check certain behaviors of this main system. That's kind of how they're doing it right now. These subordinate checking systems that do that.
I mean, it's interesting because we talked about the quantification aspect of things a little bit earlier with Michelle's question, and the interviewer was asked specifically about a mathematical definition with alignment, and he said that that was unlikely. So, I mean, it is a different approach, but I think it also compares and contrasts the emergence approach. And I think that it helps bring context to the question that we're trying, or the topic that we're trying to explore. Sometimes it's good to state the opposite. So next up, I have Vanessa, followed by Mike.
Yeah, I definitely have an example how it doesn't use reason or logic. Mark had led something on ChatGPT. It's just like, it's a moon larger than Pluto. And it did correct its answer somewhat, but if you're having a conversation with it, would contradict itself. But this may be a future topic. Can you imagine if you said, okay, if you were to devise a framework of an AI system, would it kind of follow the framework it was set up, or could it be completely different? And the other thing was, can it kind of develop nuance? Because I had put a thing, create a poem kind of with a negative tone about, what a Philadelphia might write about, Canadian geese. It kind of had Philly-tude to it. I use the, Philly attitude, like the South Philly type thing. It was like a little more personalized versus kind of a generic, okay, it's a little negative tone, but you could see, oh, someone in South Philly may have written this. Is it developing nuance? Or just the fact that, from its data set, is it able to kind of make it a little more personalized versus the generic?
Okay, so the way I can answer that is to look at or try to explain how these systems are trained. How do they learn? How do they embody what it is how they behave, right? What's the right way to behave? What's the wrong way to behave? And in an unconstrained system, meaning a system that doesn't have these alignment type of modules added onto it, in the raw system by itself, what it's doing is it's basically taking lots and lots of data, and this is all about massive amounts of data. That's why the word machine learning is also, there's another version of it called deep learning. Deep learning meaning that there's there's a huge depth to the amount of information that these systems are given. Modern machine learning systems, by their nature, are a part of the deep learning infrastructure, because you have to have massive amounts of information. So if you take a lot of information about any system, and I'll give 2 examples. One example is that if you take all of that information, and in that information, there's a lot, and let's assume that we're only talking about the English version, okay? Because in reality, the data that's given is from many languages, not only English. But let's limit ourselves only to English. And if it's scouring through all this English, and what I mean by scouring is it's not really doing anything actively. What it's doing is it's trying to build, the simplest way for me to explain it is, there was a talk that I gave earlier where if you look at word maps, people who understand what a word map is, if you remember the talk that I gave on that, that's in a sense what these systems are doing. They're building a word map off of these billions of pieces of information, okay? A probabilistic map of how often, not only how often do words exist, but how often do combinations of words exist, and how often do the meanings of a specific word, like the meaning of the word bank, right? The word bank can refer to a financial institution, but it can also refer to the riverbank, right? So the word bank, when it sees it, how often does it refer to a financial institution? How often does it refer to a riverbank? Okay? The statistical correlation between that. All of these different types of representations of every word and every combination of the words that are on the World Wide Web. It's coalescing that into this very, very complicated map, word cloud. Okay, that's what it's doing inherently. It's doing nothing else other than that. That's the most simple way I can explain what these systems are doing, okay, during training. They're taking all the data and internally they're building a word cloud, but it's more than a simple word cloud. It's a very complicated word cloud of the interassociations between words, the interassociations between meanings of words, compound meanings of words. And so if you look at that, if it sees an English word that's associated with bank, financial institution, and it sees another word that it doesn't recognize, it happens to be another language, but it's always in the context of a financial institution, it might make the association that this foreign language word and the English word bank have a relevance to each other because they both happen to appear in context of financial institutions. So it might therefore kind of guess that this foreign word either means or refers to the English word bank. It isn't trained to associate the two. It doesn't know that for a fact. It only sees a statistical correlation between the usage of this foreign language word, which it doesn't know, which happens to occur oftentimes around finance, and this English word bank, which oftentimes occurs around finance, but also occurs around other ideas because the word bank in English doesn't have just one meaning. So this is how it does it. It builds these very complicated associations between tokens. It's not even words, it's between tokens. This is the reason why I can do the same thing with images and other types of information. It's not limited to words. So when you're talking about nuance and can it develop a negative tone around South Philly, I think that's a phrase you used, Vanessa. If all these English words that it got had enough South Philly nuance in it, it would pick it up. But if it didn't have enough South Philly nuance, if it had a tiny amount of South Philly nuance, then the question is, could that arise, could that emerge in a complex way as we saw Swahili and these other things emerge? We don't know because we don't know how these other things emerged. In theory, because the system was able to do it in other areas, in theory, it might be able to do it with South Philly dialect also. I don't know. But the system should not have been able to do what it did with Swahili, and it should probably won't do it with South Philly dialect. But it's the normal way that it's trained. It would not get this. It would not develop a South Philly nuance unless there's a substantial amount of information that it has about South Philly dialect and negative tone that you referred to. Unless it has a substantial amount of that information, it wouldn't be able to create it out of nothing. So hopefully that.
So we have Mike followed by Ian, and then
a short comment on Penrose, which you probably have heard more than you wanted to know in this discussion today. The issue that occurs is that the synaptic junction is very, very small, and that's where this can occur. And by evidence thereof, the eye is a modified brain cell, where the rods and cones are modified brain cells, evolved brain cells, that can detect nanowatts of energy because of quantum effects, and so so this can occur at room temperature and not affect decoherence. Now, the issue about the main subject, the autocomplete thing is a good analogy, and that is exactly what's happening. There's two other things that go on that are trainable. You could do the autocomplete with the probabilities of all words that follow each other and have a Monte Carlo approach to solve it. But that would be very inefficient, but we could likely give similar results. But so the issue that's there is you have to have, and this has the training issue involved, a genetic algorithm that decides on how you evaluate these graphs that you build of combination of words and how you score them to decide which ones you keep and which ones you prune. And that's where a lot of training is. and where some of the imagination in the thing is. Now, I don't pretend to know how to operate, how GPT really operates. However, Wolfram has a 2-hour presentation which he described how he integrated GPT as a front end to Mathematica, and he talks about these evaluation criteria, and the evaluation criteria, to me, kind of explains how the ants find a straight line to go to the right picnic by kind of trial and error swarming. And I think and how Wolfram got it to be a good front end for Mathematica without having to understand Mathematica. Well, not really Mathematica, his evolved version of Mathematica that he calls Alpha. So those are threads to pull on to determine how this works. And there are several people who've extended GPT-3. And one final question: are your experiments with GPT? Are they with the GPT-3, or have you paid the money to get the GPT-4, or have a pack to get GPT-4? And is Bing a kind of an intermediate version of GPT-4?
Yeah, I don't have access to GPT-4 yet. It's restricted, and I don't need access right now. I can see it's much more sophisticated, but I'm not. I mean, eventually I'll start using it, but at this point I don't have a immense need to. I mean, the progression of behavior is evident, and I can see from GPT-3 to ChatGPT to GPT-4 and their other systems. It's evident where things are going, at least for me. Some of the things that you mentioned, Mike, I have to. So when you talk about Penrose and a synaptic junction, again, synaptic junction, the size of it is definitely not a quantum scale, so that again would not explain it. Synaptic junctions are micrometers in gap distance. They are not at the quantum level. They are nowhere near the quantum level. So again, that's not going to help.
You're saying the rods and cones aren't evolved brain cells that are?
So hold on. Oh, rods and cones, that's a separate thing. Let me get into that. That was the second thing you raised. I talked first, you only mentioned about the synaptic junction being possibly helping with consciousness, the quantum effect that Penrose talked about. You raised this point about synaptic junction. I said no, that can't happen with synaptic junction. Well, with eyes, so yes, it's true that if you look at the development of any organism, most of the organisms out of the initial neuronal cells develop many other types of structures, including the eye itself and the retina cells itself. That's true. But then when you talked about the aspect of the rods and cones working at quantum levels, that's I don't know how to describe it, but that's a misinterpretation, because if you think about it, eyes are dealing with photons. Photons are discretely quantum, particles, waves and particles both. They're discretely quantum entities. Okay, they are quanta. They are the quanta that, one of the first types of quanta that quantum mechanics dealt with. So photons are intrinsic to quantum mechanics. And therefore, saying that because eyes pick up photons, that eyes are quantum mechanical, no, that's not true. Because what the photon basically does is the photon excites a single orbital in an atom somewhere in a rod or a cone. It excites a single atom, and excites it from a low energy state to probably a higher energy state, which eventually causes an increase in the information energy, and that electron, if it gets pushed out of the atom, it would become a conducting electron, which would create a current. So when you talk about the micro wattage, yeah, so all these things you're saying are true, but the interpretation you're applying to it to kind of say that it's quantum effects, it's not quantum effects, because once the photon hits the atom and it throws the electron into a higher state, it's no longer quantum after that. After that, it's higher order behavior, and everything else in the brain, including the retina, after that becomes non-quantum. So I don't agree with it. It starts as quantum because a photon is obviously quantum. That part, yes. But once it hits a rod or a cone, we should not say it's quantum, because it really isn't at that point. It's important to make the distinction.
If not for the thermal noise would bury the relatively few nanowatts of light that come in. If you didn't have the junction, a narrow junction that worked at room temperature, otherwise you wouldn't have room temperature. And there are other devices that are field effect transistors. Also, the junction is important, and the junction is a few nanometers or less thick to have detected it. Oh, okay. That's an issue.
Thank you, Mike.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, God.
Yeah, I study those areas also, Mike, and that's not the topic, so I don't want to go too much into it, but I don't buy that. I mean, I understand what you're saying, but it doesn't explain it. It's not sufficient to explain what we want to understand about consciousness.
Yeah, I think I think the whole Penrose discussion kind of was a little bit off of topic earlier. Next up we have Ian.
This probably may be a bit of attention as well, but Sanjay brought up before. Sanjay alluded briefly to the alignment problem, and indicated that, for instance, that AI systems, which apparently imbibe bigotry from the web, were somehow not aligned or had to be realigned, so to speak, as a subset of the general alignment problem. But again, there's a bit of a tangent, but this raised the question, aligned with whom? The species is not one monolith, and basically quite a bit of the species is bigoted, and that's no less of a human direction, vector, shall we say, than the non-bigoted stuff that some are saying the system has to be aligned with, where basically if you choose one ideology or some postulates to be aligned with in terms of these values, basically you're saying, okay, we're aligning ourselves with one subset of humanity, not the entire humanity, not all of humanity. And keep in mind also that however good an ideology or an ethical viewpoint or system is, it harbors some fallacies or some blind spots, some imperfections that a system would pick up if it was aligned with that. So again, this is a bit of a tangent, but just reflecting on this in light of Sanjay's brief allusion to the alignment stuff, I'm thinking more and more that honestly, I think all this alignment stuff is a bunch of hooey. That basically there's no way to align an AI system perfectly with this hypothetical monolithic entity called humanity for all time. It simply is nonsense. I understand Elon Musk and the likes alarm, but I think it's not doable, and we'll simply have to feel the danger as best we can. Sorry for the tangent, but I thought a worthy sentiment to voice.
Yeah, a lot of what you said, Ian, applies. It is that alignment is a very difficult set of constraints that we have to apply to these systems. And the reason why it's difficult is because humanity itself doesn't agree with a lot of it, or we can't define exactly what we want these systems to align to. But this initial set of alignment solutions, and I shouldn't use the term solution because it is a complicated thing. We're not solving it in a sense. We're simply chipping away at the worst aspects of the problem. So that's in a sense what this first wave of alignment is trying to do, is that these systems are behaving in ways that are completely antithetical to what we expect. What we expect of a quote unquote intelligent being to be. it must be honest and truthful. I mean, and these systems aren't yet. So that's the first level of alignment that we're trying to grapple at, to make them, not make them, but kind of check them into, because we're adding in these other systems which check and cross-check the core AI system. So, again, we can't get it to be aligned because, as you said, Ian, there is no perfect behavior for all of humanity. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to chip away to get it not as rough around the edges as it is right now.
Understood. I would toss in the caveat, though, that it's just that an intelligent system like an AI should be honest and truthful. Yet reams of human thought and literature have gone into basically the art of deception, from Machiavelli to what's it, the 38 Laws of Power, whatever it's called, and the like, to simply the art of diplomacy. So even the contention that the intelligent system should be honest and truthful as a hallmark, it doesn't hold up. Even the likes of Richard Dawkins talking about evolution, basically has postulated that much of what the organisms do is lie and deceive each other, even at a level below consciousness. So not really sure that demanding the AI be truthful and honest alike is a hallmark of intelligence, or for that matter, is doable. It can be constrained to such. So.
Thank you, Ian. I don't see any other explanation points in the chat. I think this is a very good discussion. We went down a few different paths, and so I appreciate everybody's questions. So where do we go from here, Sanjay? What is the next topic? You laid the basics of emergence theory on the table. Some of the basic definitions, and given us a bit of the idea of the framework. And again, we even went into some other topics that were unexpected. But where do what do you see yourself doing next? Is this part of a series, or is it part of something you'll come back to in the future? So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, the approach that I'm taking with these talks and discussions is that I don't want to stay on one thread for too long, because sometimes some people are not interested in one particular area of the discussion. So I try to change, each month we have slightly different, although there are common threads throughout all of them. Consciousness is one of those threads that is of interest to many people. And so I try to tie many of them during the discussion. I'll bring in the topic of consciousness, but the central thesis in that discussion is not consciousness itself, even though it is related. And again, because this specific topic of, and the topic tonight was emergence, but the broader topic was how do these complex behaviors, how can we explain complex behaviors in any kind of neural system, artificial systems or biological systems? How do you explain them? Can we develop a model that helps us to understand them, to predict them, to even develop them? So those are some of the ideas around this thread, around artificial intelligence systems, that they will help us to understand the biological systems, because there are a lot of parallels between them. They seem to behave, I don't mean microscopically, I mean what happens inside of a large language model, or inside of a GAN, which is a visual type of artificial network, a visual processor of artificial networks. Inside of those systems, what happens at the minutest level is not like what happens inside of most brains. Although what we've seen is that inside of GANs, inside of these image processing neural networks, they actually do spontaneously organize themselves in similar ways to how parts of our occipital lobe, our image processing area in our human brain and mammalian brains, they have a lot of strong parallels in terms of the structure of how the brain has developed. So it's surprising that we see that, and these systems aren't trained to do that.
that was an interesting area that we did not get into as a spontaneous organization. And I thought that that was where we were going to actually start, to be quite honest, in a way, because that you're talked about different systems in your write-ups and different, how they emerge from nature. And I thought that that would have been an interesting thing that maybe we can come back to at a later date. As well as, we did touch on complexity, but I think this is an interesting start. As we build on this, I would hope, in the future, we can go a number of different directions with it. But very much appreciate, the work that you put into today's presentation. As always, was wonderful. And I'm just going to go to some of our upcoming events. The upcoming events are tomorrow. We'll be covering the Gospel of John, chapter 16. And Gary will be back for that after defending his thesis. So we're looking forward to that. Design Your Life on this will be this Friday at 9 p.m. and that will deal with holistic medicine. So it's a more Eastern approach. We have an expert that's coming in from I forget, I think she's from Beijing. And so that'll be an interesting evening, and I encourage you to attend. It's always good to learn about alternative forms of self-care. And we'll be studying on Saturday Asian philosophies. We'll be studying Shuangzi. That's the happy excursion, and that is I hope I said that right. Actually, I think it's Shuangzu, if I were to say it correctly. And then it would be elicit, and that is our play, part of our Great Classics Plays series, and that'll be at 5 p.m. on Sunday. As well as our Buckminster Fuller series will be continuing this Sunday, and I believe that it will include a video from Buckminster Fuller where people will share their perspectives on that video. So I'll be interested to hear, because sometimes, we're hearing from different people that have advanced Bucky's ideas, but it'll be interesting to go back to the source itself, himself, and to see what people take away from some of his past recordings. So I really appreciate everybody staying this evening. I know it's a little bit later than usual, but it's been a fantastic presentation. I really hope you build on this topic as we go forward. I think we set up a foundation, and I hope everybody has a nice evening.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.